Good afternoon, Paul Harrison.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Meet the Archaeologist. Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.
You're very welcome. Well, don't thank me yet. But
We'll see how the interview
yeah, see
goes.
how it goes.
Yeah,
But can you possibly just introduce yourself and also a little bit of your interest, I suppose, to the boys and girls at home?
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so my name is Dr. Paul Harrison. I have a PhD in Egyptian archaeology from University College London, Institute of Archaeology. I worked in the field as an archaeologist for a while for MOLAS, and most recently I've kind of moved sideways into archaeological media and being a historical communicator of sorts.
Okay. Now, interestingly, when we first got in touch, you did send me some clips of sort of videos you'd done supporting sort of the historical
Right.
elements of computer games. But that's
Yeah.
not what I'm interested in talking about today. You can find them yourselves, children. But what intrigues me, I suppose, is some of the stuff that we've been talking about previously, sort of off camera, I guess. Um, can you describe to me why you got into your particular interest? I mean, I can see over your shoulder some Egyptological stuff there. Why Egypt?
I think Egypt is kind of the headliner
Uh-huh.
as far as archaeology in the public sphere or public perception is
Hmm.
concerned. Um, Obviously, there's an understanding once you're inside the field that Egypt is just one of many ancient civilizations in the ancient Near East and Africa, and it just happened to be particularly good at branding. But I think because I have an interest in public engagement,
Hmm.
and I was always interested in museums, archaeological media, film, television, that kind of thing, books.
Hmm.
Um, Egypt, in a sense, has an immediacy that speaks to us on an almost kind of archetypal level. So, so for me,
So in
Egypt.
that sense, you sort of there's a shorthand that's been developed through architecture,
Oh,
Hollywood,
absolutely,
all this kind of thing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, what you said, that's actually much better.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank
let's
you.
use that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Egypt developed the shorthand. We'll cut you out. No. No, but it really does. I mean, I think when I was reading, there's a UCL Press series, Encounters with Ancient Egypt, and there's a book in that series called Consuming Ancient Egypt.
Hmm.
And in that, there's an article by, I think it's Price and MacDonald, who talk about the Egyptians really being amongst the first to kind of come up with these archetypal forms. It's really easy visual shorthand, like you say, which seems to speak to us aesthetically and psychologically, and almost we kind of create, like, our relationship with Egypt, ancient Egypt in particular, obviously, is quite an interesting one because we co-create the narrative ourselves, especially in the West, and we've been doing that for about 2 centuries. So there's a lot of stuff to get your teeth into when it comes to public engagement with the past.
I think actually in a previous interview, it was Cara Cooney who said that in many ways we haven't been able to top, especially Egypt, when it comes to the impact of the architecture, in so much as just as much as those guys wanted you to believe that they were gods on earth, it
Yeah.
works. Even though some people, you can be an atheist and still go, that is a very, very impressive structure. It's awe-inspiring. But how because I know that you have a particular interest in how that sort of stuff is still in some ways alive today. I mean, can you sort of talk us through that? How this sort of imagery, where this research went?
Yes, absolutely. So the research for me went in kind of two directions. One side is kind of the slightly more obvious direction of looking at the way that popular culture appropriates ancient Egyptian iconography and regurgitates it back to us in the forms of fiction, films, The Mummy, that kind of thing. And the other direction it went in was this kind of slightly more esoteric route, where I was looking at the ways in which Egyptian culture, in particular its more mystical attributes, had survived or endured or been revived through the centuries, through millennia, in fact, by different interest groups, focusing on those groups who happen to be in the West. So we're starting with the Rosicrucians, we're looking at Freemasons, and then later into, works of the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, and eventually into eclectic pagan worship. And what I discovered whilst I was researching these different areas were a community who call themselves the Kemetic community. They number several thousand. There are many in Europe and the United States. Not limited to those places, but that's kind of where the largest bodies are. And they are reviving and reconstructing ancient Egyptian religion to various degrees of what we would call historical authenticity. But interestingly, you know, for me as an Egyptologist, they're using Egyptological resources and primary kind of first-hand Egyptian resources. So for me, there was a really interesting crossover there to examine.
So just to sort of like just pull that out a little bit. I used to work with lots of usually guys, but quite a few girls as well, who really got into being Vikings, you know, and I still haven't quite lost the beard, you know, and so some of them to this day they will tell you that you know that they believe in Thor, you know. And yet, when I really kind of have a conversation with them, it's clear that they don't actually believe that lightning strikes are Thor's hammer on an anvil or whatever. That there is actually it's more like they're engaging with the imagery, and I suppose also the possibly a slightly sort of post-Christian rebellion almost in terms of the idea of paganism. I mean, right. it sounds as though this what you were looking at sort of ranges from essentially, as you say, looking at imagery, but also through to actually. I mean, if you're using original sources, presumably people doing research are actually helping to create a religion. I mean, how does that make you feel as an Egyptologist if someone's going to look at what someone who's, you know, in your field has translated, and they're going to start practicing that?
Well, that's a really good question, because that for me was the starting point, really. You know, how is this perceived by Egyptology, if at all? And I obviously can't embody the whole field on that, so I had to kind of look historically at the way that Egyptology has interacted with those on the fringe, so to speak, or those on the esoteric path, and where they engage and where they do not. So if we're looking at Egyptology as kind of the study of, traditionally at least, the archaeology and texts of ancient Egypt, where do we stand on people reconstructing those things? And I think it's really interesting that in other fields of archaeology, phenomenology is a very accepted, kind of established form of the exploration, like you say, you know, Viking reconstruction, etc., etc.
Or for example, walking the Avery Plain, you know, to try and understand Stonehenge.
Yeah, it's the subjective experience of that mindset. It's an exploration of living in that person's shoes. Now, in Egyptology, I think because it's such a high-profile area that has been examined, sometimes ridiculed by the public, dressing up as Egyptians doesn't ever seem to have been part of the appeal. You know, reconstructing or reenacting Egyptian practices amongst Egyptology is somewhat frowned upon, and we could get into quite a big kind of debate about why that is. But ultimately, it seems to be left to those who are practicing outside of the field to explore, and rarely, if ever, looked at as a potential source of useful information. So when I encountered the movement, my first question was, well, what sources are being used? What is the interest in the degree of authenticity in the revival or reconstruction, and you know, how and why were the really big questions for me. And of course, those last two are very much individual and depend on whether someone is solo practicing or part of a group. But when it came to the other questions, with regards to what sources were being used and how people were practicing this Kemeticism, it appeared that there was a spectrum, you know, of practices, as one might expect. And I started to call this a Kemetic spectrum or Kemetic continuum.
Kemetic continuum, I like it.
The Kemetic continuum, yeah, that's what I call it in the book.
Did you spell the continuum with a K?
Well, I didn't want to go that far.
Okay.
I know that we're really good at making up words as Egyptologists and archaeologists, but I didn't go down that route. But so in the book, I'm looking at the range of practices, and in as kind of non-judgmental capacity as possible, trying to understand these practices, these sources, the reasonings behind those, and how people along the different points of that spectrum, and that spectrum represents everything from the eclectic Wiccan at one end, who may not be as concerned with historical authenticity, but more concerned with symbology and meaning and intent, all the way over to the what you'd maybe call the more conservative end of that spectrum, where you have quite strict historical constraints on the reenactment of ritual, and very much a concern with authentic practice and authentic ritual and authentic depiction and inclusion of Egyptian gods and imagery and practices.
Well, this is something I suppose I find really interesting because, as you say, classically, I suppose, archaeologists, whether they like to admit it or not, they kind of, at their worst, view themselves as gatekeepers, especially the further back you go in time. Because archaeologists are the ones who tend to soak themselves in knowledge. They tend to be the ones who are the experts. But presumably, if you're going into people's homes and they're talking to you, even if it's not what you would class as being an accurate conclusion, in some respects, you're still having to sort of work with that. And do you think that's something that actually, I suppose, archaeologists and Egyptologists can learn about? I guess engaging with, I suppose, what some other people might call pluralism, as it were. Because at the same time, I also feel, for example, I come back to Stonehenge. Frustrating there. I try to avoid Stonehenge as a case study, but it's a good one in this example. Because actually, there's a very strong focus there from people who would say that they are modern practices of a religion and a monument, and yet. With Egyptology, there's a much stronger absolute connection between, we know because there was writing, basically. We know what was going on. So, where do you sort of plug yourself into that? I mean, I suppose to sort of sum that, I know I've asked quite a lot there, but to sort of sum it up, given that these practices were essentially a state religion, with, with a, as it were, no pun intended, someone at the top of a pyramid. Sure. And that can no longer be plugged into a state. How do you find yourself connecting to this as someone who understands that, if so to mean?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And kind of during the course of the study, I ended up having to struggle with a lot of questions that most ethnographers would have to struggle with, to be honest. And I ended up looking towards pagan studies for some of the answers for these.
In terms of your approach, or in terms of? In terms of
the approach, right, yeah. In terms of the approach, and in terms of actually encounters with the other. I think it's very important to recognize that no researcher, no one, is an island or sits in a bubble of, cool, collected objectivity. Absolutely nobody is objective. No. And so once you recognize that you are holding a subjective position, it becomes possible to deal with it. So you become a test subject as much as anyone else in your study, because you have to be reflexive about what you're doing. So that's kind of the basics in ethnography, and you would hopefully take that approach into any situation, irrespective of the group. Now, to deal with Kemetic, the Kemetic community in general, or people who are dealing with a spiritual reality, I think the thing that struck me the most when I was talking with the community and getting to know them and spending an awful lot of time engaging in email correspondence and this kind of thing, and building kind of relationships, was that actually literally the only difference in so many cases was the acceptance or denial of the relevance of the spiritual reality to the material that was being dealt with. So on the one hand, obviously, the Kemetics are accepting that the spiritual reality of this is absolute. And Egyptologists, by and large, I don't want to generalize, and I can't speak for everyone, but Egyptologists, by and large, are saying the spiritual reality of this is irrelevant. Now, when you start to kind of unpack those two positions, you realize that in a practical sense, there's only really one difference that creates. And that difference is a line that Egyptologists draw in the sand for ourselves, beyond which we can't pass. It stops being Egyptology, it stops being an ology, it stops being a scientific study of Egypt. And that is kind of ipso facto part of the field. And I think Egyptology in general is moving towards a much more kind of self-conceived notion of it being a progressive scientific discipline in an effort to move away from that culture historical reputation that it has as being behind other archaeological fields, which, I mean, I think is a fair notion.
Well,
it is.
To be fair, I've talked to Egyptologists who I've been downright challenged to drinking contests, frankly, by them. But I mean, you might say that puts them ahead or behind. I don't know. But but the point is, I mean, yeah, they are a self-identified community within, I suppose, the broader archaeological community. But I wouldn't say that they're behind or necessarily, precisely because actually I think of the potential for studies such as this, and something which I'm very interested in, I suppose, in this thing here. Is the fact that actually, I mean, for example, in my day-to-day dealings, I sometimes get people, obviously asking questions about, archaeology, but occasionally I get questions in the form of statements, and they essentially just sort of say, wouldn't archaeology be better if we could just get rid of all this ritual nonsense, and essentially study ritual as repeated activity. And I think that's sort of similar to this line that you're sort of describing there, whereby, in many respects, if you take out the acceptance of, if not the reality, then certainly the reasoning of the ritual, then it is just repeated activity. And yes, actually, that repetition simply drives you crazy. It's not something which actually, repetition without purpose is meaningless, if you see what I mean. And you can spiral. And so in some ways, I suppose, accepting the reality that even if you, I'm talking to whoever asks that question, don't want to engage with their reasoning, they had a reasoning, I guess, and so in that sense, do you think that actually that's one of the sort of the key lessons to take away from this sort of research, is that maybe there's something to learn from modern day practices of ancient religion, especially if there's a demonstrable continuity, as it were.
Absolutely, and I think that was the major conclusion of the work, without giving too much away. There is absolutely a lot to be taken away from these practices, and a lot to learn from the phenomenological experience of someone reconstructing ritual. For starters, they come across pragmatic concerns that we don't necessarily consider in that much depth during the kind of theoretical study of those rituals, or the abstract study of those rituals. For instance, taboos, different taboos from different nomes of Egypt at different times, gender taboos, things linked to things like menstruation. Little bit of research there in Egyptology, but actually not a great deal. Less than half a dozen papers. So there are some real practical concerns that some very interesting and intelligent research and thought goes into answering those things on a practical level from the Kemetic community. So that was very interesting for me.
And this is precisely because they're having to. These problems come into their lives because they're living it.
Exactly right.
In so much as, going to menstruation, if you're a female Egyptologist, you don't have to think about it as an ancient Egyptian, because you've got modern day products to deal with that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it parallels the way, in some senses, that the Egyptians responded to these interruptions, in John Baines's terms, interruptions and to their lives in different ways. There was a state response and a personal response. And in a sense, you have that also here. You've got the state response of Egyptology and the personal response of the Kemeticist. And there are kind of parallels all over there. But you're absolutely right. It's, it throws up considerations that you wouldn't necessarily have as an Egyptologist, which make for really interesting areas of research, I think.
Okay. I am fascinated by this, but I don't want to just sort of keep on digging away at something, especially if it's not fully published. So maybe we could come back to it at some point in the future. Who knows? I'm sure.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. The book should be out in a few months, hopefully, with UCL and Taylor and Francis or Routledge.
Okay, cool. I will probably try and get hold of a copy. Assuming I've dug myself out of certain computer game holes I'm about to get into.
Yeah, it's a big read.
Exactly. But okay, well let's move on to the questions which I ask everyone in these interviews, because actually cool. These interviews are an attempt to sort of answer a meta question. What's it like being an archaeologist? There's no one answer, and therefore I want some points of comparison. So the first question is, for you, Dr. Paul Harrison, what is the most satisfying thing about being an Egyptologist?
I think for me, because of the nature of my work, the most satisfying aspect of being an Egyptologist is being able to communicate different lessons and experiences from the practice and study of Egyptology to the public, who are, by and large, extremely interested in what I do. So, and sometimes that has a downside, obviously. Sometimes when you're on a plane, the last thing you want to say is, I'm an Egyptologist, because you're trapped for 5 hours in a conversation about it. I pretend I'm a plumber.
So it's sorry. I don't mean to go off topic here, but actually, I have a friend who's a car mechanic, and he has to do the same thing. Because if you say I'm a car mechanic, someone goes, "Oh, my car's been making a funny noise." It's like, or they say, or for example, "Did you see that film? What do you think of Ridley Scott's Exodus?" And you're like, "Oh."
Exactly. Yeah, you become the. Particularly if you're seen as an Egyptologist. Here's an interesting thing that I've noticed over the years. If you're an Egyptologist or an archaeologist, or you have any kind of formal qualification in that area, there seems to be an assumption that you operate exactly like fictional archaeologists and know everything about every ancient topic in the world. I don't know many people who know.
You don't.
Imagine, having 3,500 years of an entire culture's history to deal with, and even though we're only dealing with a sliver of it, it's an awful lot of material that no one person has ever mastered. We're all specialised, we're all niche, we've all got our areas. But it's really interesting that there's still this public perception that anyone with an archaeology kind of degree or PhD understands everything about the ancient world, and you just think, well, that's kind of like me asking you to know absolutely everything about the modern world and all of our science and all of our arts and all of our culture. It's beyond impossible. But on the other hand, it's great to be in an area which is so kind of high profile and does provoke this kind of public engagement and provides so many really rich examples of modern cultural appropriations for you to play with and kind of ponder and enjoy. As an Egyptologist, for instance, I went to see Philip Glass's Akhenaten opera last year, which was really fascinating, really interesting to see what had been used and how they'd reconstructed the language and turned that into song, and how there was some ritual being reconstructed on stage. And a lot of menacing juggling, actually, as well. There's a lot of juggling.
Okay.
So it's very satisfying, but also very frustrating.
Okay. Well, the second question I ask everyone is, what challenges do you think are on the horizon? You can talk about Egyptology or archaeology more broadly if you want, but what would you think is coming up that perhaps people need to be aware of or more aware of?
That's a really good question and a really important question, because I think the challenges for Egyptology are pretty pointed and pretty unique at the moment. So, for instance, in a very practical sense, we have the results of the Arab Spring, revolution in Egypt, mass looting, loss of permits, change of the Supreme Council of Antiquities head several times. The status of archaeology over there is somewhat unstable. And even though I know they're working very hard to make it a safe place for tourism and archaeological discovery again, there's still a perception, I think, in the West particularly, that it's still somewhat dangerous to be a Westerner over there. So that in itself is a challenge, and it's a challenge in a practical sense when you work in historical media, because particularly if you're working with American production companies, there's a perception that it's not a good time to be filming in Egypt. Or at least hasn't been for the last few years. I think it's changing slowly. So that's one of the practical concerns. And I think one of the things that highlighted, which is really important, is that Egyptology as it was is over, frankly. It has to change and it has to adapt, and it can't be this, like you said earlier in the interview, we can't see ourselves as the gatekeepers. We can't see ourselves, especially as Western Egyptologists, as having automatically the right to enter that country and examine their heritage. We in the West see it as world heritage, and of course in Egypt it's very much Egyptian heritage. Well, even though there are cultural considerations there, obviously.
Yeah, and also I suppose to a certain extent we only see it as world heritage because there's a very strong sort of post-colonial, post-Napoleon, post British Empire kind of thing going on there. So yeah, I can totally see why. From the other end, no, reclaiming that is a powerful act, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's that. You think that's the impact of that is still sort of rippling out then?
I think the impact of that is really yet to be properly measured. To be honest, I mean, I have a subjective experience of the impact of that being a decrease in the number of jobs in Egyptology in academia, because many Egyptologists who were in Egypt came back to Britain and filled posts in universities and were more qualified, because they were willing to take jobs because of the work shortage. You have people going to universities taking jobs that they're perhaps a little overqualified for. So in a very practical sense, there is a knock-on effect of that. But there's also, I think, a more subtle political, it's maybe not even that subtle, political result, and that is that Egyptology is at a time now where it really has to get a lot more introspective and figure out how to put its best foot forwards to serve the needs not only of the field but of Egyptian people, managing that heritage. And I think worldwide as well, there's a lot of contest over the quote-unquote ownership of Egyptian material and heritage and culture, and I think it's time to start reaching out and negotiating some of those things and working with some of those ideas and talking to people in, for instance, Egyptian communities who are interested in Egyptian heritage from a scholarly perspective, talking with Afrocentric communities who are interested in Egypt as a representation of the history of the black diaspora. So reaching out to these different interest groups and saying, well, what do we have in common? What would we all like to see? And how can we kind of progress knowing that we do have common goals? I think there's something interesting to be had there, and I think that's why engagement is really more important than it's ever been now.
So the third question I ask everyone in these interviews is, what would you say to someone who wants to get into archaeology, or in this case perhaps Egyptology? And I was sort of thinking actually while we were talking just before, for me, I've always been inspired by sort of really wonderful children's books like this, essentially, in terms of Egyptology. And do you think in that sense it's easier to get into Egyptology from a younger age, precisely because it is so, it's so iconic and so it's out there, it's in books, it's all over the place.
It is everywhere. It's certainly very common to develop an interest in ancient Egypt from a young age, because we study it. It used to be Key Stage 2 at primary school. It was a part of the syllabus. I'm not sure if that's still the case. I think it is.
It is still in there. Yeah. Mhm.
It's still in there. So it's part of the syllabus, which is really interesting because it means that we are potentially manufacturing an interest in ancient Egypt in Britain and more broadly in the West, which is probably one of the only ancient civilizations next to Greece where that is actively pursued in education. So the inherent interest in Egypt is there from, I think, a very young age. There's a lot of pop culture that speaks to people of a young age. Mummy's Alive, that cartoon from a kind of decade back or so. lots of books which focus around Egypt, like Age of Ra and things like that. Lots of Egyptian-themed kids' books, as you say. You only have to look in the British Museum. They've got this huge section of kids' books. So it's very easy to kind of garner that interest at a very young age, and that's in fact where I became interested in Egypt. It was at a young age, and it was through those means and films like Indiana Jones, and later kind of playing Tomb Raider video games and things like that. So we create a virtual Egypt in our minds before we ever step foot in the country or into a university to study it, which is interesting because I think it means that Egypt can fall short of certain people's expectations because we create Egypt before we experience Egypt. So if you are considering going into a vocation in archaeology and in particular Egyptology, I think it's probably a good idea first to try and examine as much as possible what it is about the culture that you really enjoy. And is that something you can make a living from? And this is part of the reason I'm in the historical media, is because the stuff I enjoy is media based and it's outreach based and it's people based. So it's historical communication for the most part. If you identify that that's your interest early, then there are lots of different paths that you can focus on in order to improve your chances. At the same time, if you're really interested in obscure texts from the Middle Kingdom, then eventually you can create that niche and you can sit in a basement in a museum and you can translate those for a living. So there are paths there, and I appreciate that we don't always know what we're interested in until we're exposed to it. But I think it's a very good idea to try and kind of sort out in your own mind, what is it about this ancient culture, any ancient culture, that I'm particularly attracted to? Is that something exclusive to that ancient culture, or would I experience that studying archaeology more generally? Would I experience that studying architecture more generally, or art, or pottery, sculpture, these kinds of things? So when you narrow it down and you identify what it is, you can break it into the components to figure out what you need to study to get to the point you want to get to. So my advice, I think, overall would be strategic about how you enter a career in archaeology, because it is fierce. The competition is fierce, it's not going to be necessarily an easy ride finding paid work in archaeology. Although there's generally quite a lot of rescue archaeology going on in London because of the amount of buildings. So if you're into that and you're okay with doing that for a living, then that exists. But you don't necessarily need to have an advanced degree to do that. So but write a list, ask yourself some questions and take it from there. Going and doing a PhD in Egyptology may seem like the natural way into the field, but it's definitely not the only way into the field.
Okay. That's certainly an interesting answer to that question, so it's just a bit of self-interrogation. Because often people sort of they advocate, just turn up and get involved or go and ask some people some questions. But actually, maybe, especially I suppose when it comes to Egypt, what do you? So, for example, in my case, it probably would be the architecture that I was interested in. Therefore, is there another way of doing that? And especially, I suppose, an art historical approach as well. Is something which is very common. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. It might be that you don't like actually digging. It might be that you don't like working outside, and it might be that there's a lot of it's such a huge topic and subject now.
Yeah.
That it's worth really investigating what it is you want to do.
Okay.
Within it.
Well, to
Yeah.
paraphrase Star Wars, I hate sand, it gets everywhere. Okay, well, thanks again. Thank you so much for your time. Just as a little snippet, actually, we had recorded this interview previously. This is a second attempt because I didn't set up my mic properly. So Paul has been very patient. Thank you so much. And, well,
Very well.
oh, thank you. And, I hope to hear from you again soon. I'm sure people at home will be interested as well.
Thank you very much.
Ta-ra.